They're not the boss of me. All right. I don't know who is. Oh, goodness. Williamson County Sheriff, maybe. Leander PD. Maybe some days. All right. So, wow. Howdy. We are going to have a quiz. Not today. Don't get upset. Not during class or anything. But it should be available tomorrow, Wednesday through Friday. I would recommend, you do what you want, but I would recommend that you take it after class, not necessarily immediately after class, but after class on Thursday. So that way you've heard, a little more material before you take it. 20 questions, you've got an hour to take it. You can only take it once. And last semester, dang, people gave me a hard time about stuff. Can you imagine? Because it's possible to take the quiz more than once, because I've allowed it to have 2 different settings, or like 2 different tries, because in case you log on, like my class earlier today, I logged on and my camera didn't work. So, if you log on and something doesn't work, or you lose the internet and it logs you off, it may have recorded you as having 1 try. So I gave you 2 tries for technical issues, not because I want you to retake the quiz. Because, it's college. Once you've seen the quiz, it's kind of an advantage if you take it again. So we can't do that. But you do have the list. Don't forget about the list of stuff to study. I think the list will be helpful. And then after the first quiz, we'll have a chat and I'll ask you if you thought it. I might even do a survey. I did a survey last semester. See if you thought it was reasonable, if you wanted more questions or fewer. I was doing like 10 or 12 questions for 40 points, and people were upset about that because if you missed one, then it was a problem, which is why I went to 20. So I don't really want it to be more than 20 because I don't want you to have to take 2 hours to take the quiz. And you've got an hour for the 20 questions. Nobody really uses that, but you can. The idea is that you take it once, that you use the information in your brain, that you not look stuff up, that you not take it with a group of people. You know what I'm saying. You take it on your own, you don't cheat. And I've told you before, I'll be more skeptical of you if your quiz questions or if your quiz grades are really high and your weekly questions are really low, those grades, because that'll kind of tell me you really don't know what you're doing. My opinion, which may not be accurate, but somehow you magically know everything when you take the quiz, which suggests stuff to me that you probably don't want to suggest. All right. I don't know if there's anything else I need to say about the quiz. Let's look at the weekly question if I can find it. Oh my gosh, did I open it? Was I so interested in the whatever that thing was that was going on? Impeachment. Yeah, impeachment. All right, let me open weekly question. Yeah, people were upset last class because I couldn't see my face. Like, yeah, my face is really worth seeing. But for whatever reason, I could share the screen. All right, here we go. So you are on question number 4. Oh, okay. Explain the impact 7 years war and pay particular attention to how the war and its outcomes shape colonial identities, relationship between colonists and Indians. You might also talk about relationship between colonists and the British. We are probably not going to talk about this today, so it's probably going to come up second half of the discussion, so more on Thursday. So sorry, but we might get there. Also on last week's question, which hopefully is graded, if you answered it a little later, then I probably haven't graded it. I'll do more grading tomorrow, but everybody who turned theirs in on time or close, because I graded on Saturday morning, I think it was, should have their stuff graded. Should. Maybe Saturday night too, probably. Because what else are you going to do on a Saturday night in a pandemic besides grade? And the biggest concern I had with number 3 was the people who didn't talk about Bacon's Rebellion, how Bacon's Rebellion impacted the shift from indentured servitude to the use of slavery for a couple of reasons that bothered me. One, I told you in class, you got to talk about Bacon's Rebellion. Makes me feel like you people don't listen to me. Also, the book was really emphatic about how Bacon's Rebellion was the big reason for the change. So I figure if the book said it and I said it and you didn't say it, that means you didn't read the book and you don't listen to me. What are you thinking? Gotta read the book and listen to me. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. All right, let me find the notes for today. I think I sneezed really loud in the last class. I'll try not to do that for you. Maybe. Oh, I really am looking for the notes and can't see them. Here we go. Making progress. Excuse me. All right. Just want to say, for some reason, my nephew, who's in high school, has been texting me all day. Is this what you guys do when you're supposed to be paying attention? I know. But he keeps asking me history and political questions. So, you know, it's hard to say no. I got to talk to the boy. I know he could be related to me if he's interested in that stuff when he's 16. Goodness. My brother's really upset with him because he's like me. He wanted him to be more like him because my younger brother's like really cool and athletic, and I'm not cool or athletic. And, you know, this poor child, he has tried to play football and he got broken. And then he tried to wrestle and he got broken. He just keeps getting broken, but he's really, really good at school. And I told my brother, I said, you know, we don't all get the same stuff genetically, and just give the poor boy a break. You know, he's a smart guy, he gets straight A's. College will be free. Just let him go. You know, the fact that he's not athletic, it's going to be okay. It's okay. Plus, my brother's an electrician. You know, the athletic stuff wasn't his path to success. It was, do I get shocked or not? All right. He mostly doesn't, by the way. Yeah, he's told me it's really good to turn off the electricity when you work on stuff. All right, textbook, chapter 4. It's talking about the increase in slavery during this time period. And this is, we're talking 1700s. The fellow Olaudah Equiano they're talking about is a former slave who gains his freedom and then writes a slave narrative. And you'll see a few of those in this era. So this is from an era where you were able to gain your freedom. Oh my gosh, who leaves their phone on? So this fellow did, and he had been of important heritage in the pre-slave days. Oh, I left my phone on in case the person who comes to get the car. That's why I left it on. Here, that's not them. Sorry. All right. So one of the things that's starting to happen during this era is the people in the Caribbean are starting to have their younger sons come to the Americas and bring slaves with them. The book's going to remind you that in the initial days of slavery, most of the slaves went to South America or the Caribbean because that's where that's where the larger plantations were that grew. That's primarily sugar, but also coffee and some other stuff. Let's see. And it does talk quite a bit in here, and Equiano talked about this, about people who come over to gain freedom and independence and that sort of stuff, but think it's okay to own people, and there might be some irony in that. And you'll see that a lot in slave narratives because how would you not express that if you, yeah. And also you'll see complaints about people who had been enslaved, and slave owners will talk about how really important to own slaves because that's an opportunity to Christianize people from Africa who probably were not exposed to Christianity, but then the way that slaves were treated was not exactly representative of the Christian faith, especially the whole raping the female slaves part. So that comes up as well in slave narratives. So, you know. It also reminds textbook, Foner, Dr. Foner, Um, also remind you about what your 8th grade teacher probably referred to as the triangle trade, but the manufactured goods that go to Africa from Europe, primarily textiles, cloth, and guns. You know what those are because it's Texas and you all have one, except me. I don't have one. Um, and that's going to arm certain tribes or certain nations within Africa who are going to start to work with the countries that are participating in the slave trade, primarily, Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, and later on England and France. So, excuse me. Ah, ow. All right. So the militarized states go from selling just your average captive guy or the people you don't like to hunting people to sell them on purpose for slaves. And they talk about the Middle Passage, about how that's a treacherous trip, how the people on the slave ships are not treated well. They mostly shove them in the cargo hold and dump water on them and throw food down to them when they do. So it's really unsanitary, unsafe. And if there's some sort of difficulty on the voyage, if the ship's starting to sink, or if they get captured and they're not supposed to, they are very willing to sacrifice the slaves, let them sink, throw them overboard, that sort of stuff while they're chained together. That becomes more of an issue, the throwing them overboard while they're chained together, when countries start to make slavery illegal. That's going to happen around the time of American independence, maybe slightly before, but there's still so many smugglers that sneak around, and most of the time they didn't get caught. Most of the slaves again went to Brazil, West Indies. Brazil, I think there's some sugar being planted there, cocoa, and coffee. Coffee. The person that keeps texting me is my friend in Brazil who actually has a little coffee farm. He sent me pictures one day of his coffee. Grows on a little tree. Who knew? I did not. Death rate for slaves and crew were high. It's a dangerous trip. Of course, the death rate for the slaves is much higher than the crew. A small number of North American slaves, as about 500,000 in the early days, but by the time of US independence has swelled to about 2.5 million, probably closer to 10 million in Brazil and the Caribbean and other places in South America, but it is primarily Brazil. 3 distinct slave systems. The book talks about the tobacco plantation system, the rice plantation system, and the non-plantation system, which is more urban, artisan, that sort of stuff. So, they're growing tobacco in the Chesapeake, because we've talked about that already, which is Virginia and Maryland. Eventually, what's the other state that grows tobacco? Kentucky, Tennessee. They're just a little west of Virginia and Maryland. And the rice, Carolinas and Georgia, coastal regions, island regions, and the non-plantation slavery is cities. Middle colonies in New England. Middle colonies, probably the primary city is Philadelphia, maybe some in Boston as well. And I know you're thinking, not in Philadelphia, because Quakers, but Quakers didn't run the thing the whole time. New England, you actually, there's a lot of farms in New England as well. Not so much in New Jersey, that's more about, cattle, but it's more from, I think the Jersey cows are more for milk. I don't know, I'm not in charge of cattle farming. Cattle ranching, cattle farming, dairy farms, that's what I'm trying to say. But you've got a whole lot of crop farming, grain farming that goes on in other New England states. So you do have some family farms that have slaves as well. But the artisan and urban slaves, those guys either work in shops where they make stuff, whatever you make during that time, pots and pans, and maybe handmade cloth or furniture, that sort of stuff. Or they might be domestic type folks, domestic servants. So cooking, cleaning, taking care of kids. And that happens more with rich people because, that's just the way that goes. because poor people do that themselves. Or the average person, it's not even poor people, is it? All right. Free black men, more common in the North than the South, less common as we get closer to the American Revolution. And it's harder and harder to become free as a former slave after you start to see slave rebellions. Yeah. So, and we're talking Stoner Rebellion at that point. Yeah, that's the early one in South Carolina. And you know what? I feel like that's not really in the notes, but you should probably know about that. I think that's on the list of stuff you should study. If not, it should be. If it's not, I'll go over it in class next time more for sure, I promise. All right. If you were a slave and you lived on a plantation, you are more likely to retain some African cultural heritage, recognizing not all the slaves were from the same countries or tribal regions in Africa, but if you're from the same region of Africa, probably the food is similar, maybe some of the religious tradition is similar, and maybe some of the languages at least, are recognizable. What you'll see is kind of a blending of that African culture. What the heck was that? We have to go all the way back. What happened? But you'll see a blending of the African cultures into something probably more commonly thought of as a slave culture. So, oops, too far. So sorry. And as far as who owns slaves, more of a Southern thing than a Northern thing. I know this isn't shocking to you. More slaves on plantations than anywhere else. Mentions that Northern urban slavery is probably 10 to 30% of the slave is that the slave population or the population overall? Dang, let me look. Who makes these notes? But there are more slaves in the South than the North for sure. More slaves on plantations than small farms or an artisan in cities. And there are more slave owners who just own one or two slaves, but there are more slaves who are owned by a smaller percentage of people. Does any of that make any sense? Yes? No? No. All right. So most of the slaves live on plantations in the South. Davis is giving me a hard time. Most of the slaves live on plantations in the South and are owned. They're on plantations where there's like 100 or more slaves. So the smaller percentage of slave owners own the larger percentage of slaves. Okay. It's like most of the wealth in the country is controlled by 2 or 3% of the people in the United States. Still true. But there are more people that have smaller amounts of wealth throughout the country. Okay. So, like Elon Musk and whoever else hangs out with him, the billionaire crowd, they have more money than Cedar Park has, but there are more people in Cedar Park that have a little bit of money. All right. I'm not even going to try anymore because it's not really going well. But I did want to look up why I wrote in that statistic and see if I can straighten that out any at all. Oh my goodness. All right. So slavery in the North section starts on 143. Dang, I'm getting old. Slaves represent 3% of the region's population in New England. So it must be higher in other places. So I'm guessing, let's see. Why did I say a 10% thing? I'll have to go back and look because I don't want to spend any more time on that. Oh, because in certain cities like New York City, there was a larger percentage of the population that was enslaved. So this 10 to 30% of the population, that is the general population, not the entire population of slaves. Okay, we're going to keep going because I'm going to make it worse if I keep going on that long time. I don't want to make it worse. All right, so slavery is going to decline in the North as there's more immigrants and you can just hire people for cheap. And let's see what else we want to talk about. Also, here's another reason that slavery declines in the North. If slavery is hereditary, but you own one slave, they're probably not going to have any kids. So you're probably just going to own a slave for one generation. And you might eventually you're more likely to make a system for your one slave to gain his freedom than you are for 100 slaves to gain their freedom. But also urban populations, there are going to be sections of town where people of slave heritage, mixed heritage are going to live comfortably and safely and freely, that sort of stuff. And that happens, of course, more in the north than the south. And especially places like New York, they're incredibly large and diverse. So not as large as they are now, and probably not as diverse. But still, for the time period, large and diverse. All right. Plantation slaves develop family structures within their grouping. So it's not that you import a whole family of slaves, but whoever comes over forms a family with someone else. And whoever moves in, more recently is kind of adopted by people. So they create family structure. They try to maintain African names, culture, heritage, that sort of stuff. Just looking at my phone, sorry. The Gullah language is a pidgin. It's kind of a combination of different languages, and it's a spoken rather than a written language, an informal language, but that develops on the islands of the Carolinas and Georgia. I recall at some point in cartoon history, there was a TV show called Gullah Island or Gullah Island that kids might have watched, and I have no idea what it was about. Because it was not my generation, and so I didn't watch it. But I do know that a famous person who grew up speaking this Gullah dialect, you know who it was? Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. You're going like, it's the black guy. Yes, it is the black guy, the really old black guy. He was raised by his grandfather who spoke this derivative of a slave language. And it's also why he kind of grew up with the tradition of not speaking so much. You listen to Supreme Court recordings or look at transcripts, he really doesn't talk a lot. He submits a lot of written stuff. And he said it was kind of a habit because his language, his formal English was not good. Now he has a law degree from Yale, so he's good now, but just a habit he got into. But anyway, slaves are more culturally African in the South because there are larger groups of slaves who live together. In urban areas, more assimilation, and there's more of a mulatto or mixed race class of folks who develop. And in the North, if you lived on a small farm, then you just adopted the culture of your family. I don't know how much you guys remember about history from this era, but there's a fairly famous later on freed slave whose name was Sojourner Truth. Have you heard of Sojourner Truth? It's fine if you haven't. She was really big. She's like 6 feet tall, and she was a field slave she worked on a farm in New York, in rural New York, but the family that owned her was Dutch. She spoke Dutch. She didn't speak any English for quite a while. So when people would go to listen to her talk about the end of slavery and why she'll work with the Freedmen's Bureau and that kind of stuff later on, they liked listening to her because of her accent. She had a Dutch accent. She's like a 6 foot tall black woman with a Dutch accent. So she was kind of a curiosity for the time period. They didn't have TV. So no, she was very popular on the lecture circuit, oddly enough. And it's how she earned money after she wasn't, she clearly didn't earn money as a slave, but as you get older, you working in the fields, and if you don't own any fields. Okay, I'm going on, sorry. All right, colonial slave rebellions were pretty rare. Right, this is where I'm supposed to talk about the Stono Rebellion, and I didn't seem to put it in. The Stono Rebellion is pretty much it. This happens in South Carolina, and I don't remember when, so let me pick that up. But the Stono Rebellion is a planned rebellion. It doesn't even materialize, but because some slaves on different plantations in South Carolina planned this rebellion, looking at my 1302 book, I'm definitely not going to find it there. because this slave rebellion is planned, even though it doesn't materialize, it's going to lead to a lot of restrictions of the movement of slaves. And I know you're thinking they didn't let slaves go anywhere. You're wrong. They did let slaves go some places sometimes, maybe to other plantations where they would go visit some relatives. But after that, it just didn't happen at all. So there's a pretty strong restriction on the impact of on the freedom of slaves. This is on page 148 and 149. Let's see, Stoner Rebellion is 1740. 1740, yeah. And that's in the middle of a bunch of other rebellions that seem to be going on. And there's also, it reminds you, there's a push. Yeah, these guys are going from plantation to plantation to try to get to Florida. There's a push to get to Florida because Spain is the first country to make slavery illegal. So the thought is if you get to Florida, you'll be free. And you will see lots and lots of runaway slaves go to Florida if they're in the South. If they're closer to Canada, you know, they're going there later. Okay. So Stoner Rebellion, 1740. Yeah, Stoner, 1740. All right. Rarely successful, and that one wasn't terribly successful, although they did kill some folks in the process. And the reason they tend not to be successful is the authorities aren't on their side, and they tend not to have a whole lot of weapons. So there you go. Colonial slave rebellions more common in the South than the North because populations are larger. They can plan together. And one of the things that you'll see happen after the Stoner Rebellion is if people were teaching their slaves to read, they're going to stop after that. And one of the consistent things you'll see in early slave rebellions is they're usually planned by people who are able to read. So the thought is if you deny slaves education, they won't have an opportunity to escape or be successful if they gain freedom. All right, slave resistance typically is running away or going to a city and pretending to be free. And I think I was reading in one of your weekly questions about how it was harder for people of African descent to escape, and it was easier for people of native descent to escape, and that's why there weren't as many native slaves as there were Africans. Also, yeah, if you enslave a Native American, their tribe is nearby. You enslave an African, it is really hard for them to get back to Africa. You know what I'm saying? So, you know, it's that proximity thing. Yeah, yeah. It's also why the Spanish didn't have great success in enslaving natives in South America, because it's where they're from. So, yeah, not cool. Doesn't work. What else do we want to talk about here? Oh, British patriotism. Trendy in the 1700s because a couple of things. One, they see themselves as the freest government in the world, which, you know, who knows, probably, maybe, I don't know, depends on your definition. And they also are starting to build an empire, which seems to be a little contradictory, but, you know. So the British see their system as most free, and there are more people in their system who are allowed to vote and participate in the government. And probably for the era, that's true. If, as long as you owned land or owned a business, you got to participate. But that meant most people didn't get to participate. I mean, still a lot of people did. You didn't have to be of royal descent. You didn't have to be famous. You didn't have to be rich, but you did have to at least own something. But their thought too is if you don't own something, you don't really, we would say something, I don't know what young people would say, but old people would say you don't have any skin in the game. Skin in the game? You don't say that. The book would say that you lack a will of your own. So you don't really have the ability to make your own decisions because you can't afford to. You don't, if you don't have financial means, your parents will explain this to you if you haven't already figured it out. When you tell them like, you're not the boss of me, you don't tell me what to do, but then they still pay your bills. If someone else is paying your bills, you lack a will of your own, is the way the book would say. I know there's still things you want to do, but the people who pay your bills probably won't allow it. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So unless you're self-sufficient financially, in this era, people didn't think your vote was a good idea because it might be irresponsible. And women, they didn't have any financial rights, legal rights, so definitely not letting them vote. During this era as well, also people who wouldn't think the right way, immigrants and Catholics, we didn't want to hear what they had to say if you were English. John Locke, other Enlightenment thinkers, do think that the government, however, is not put there by God, but that the government has a responsibility to you to take care of the big three. The big three, there's my three fingers. Life, liberty, should be and cereal right behind me. Life, liberty, and property, which could be cereal. And of course, when Thomas Jefferson writes about that lovely Enlightenment thought, he'll talk about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Because, it just sounds better. Sounds more enlightened, doesn't it? All right. So Locke and other Enlightenment thinkers do think that if your government is not protecting the big three, there we go, three again, then you got to trade your government in. So the government has a responsibility to the governed. And that's kind of a new thing. It used to be, well, God picked this family, so they're going to be your kings and queens forever, whether they treat you like crap or treat you well. At this point, at least, property owners needed to be protected by their government. So it's progress. Yeah, progress. Okay. So the right to vote, opportunity to gain property, greater in the colonies as well. So you're starting to see this kind of British pride even bigger in the colonies, which is going to create a problem because the English government is not going to see the colonists as English citizens. They're going to see them as colonists because they don't live in England. They've never lived in England. Maybe their parents lived in England, but that's been a long time. So they're not really English. So they're just little scummy colonists and their culture's wrong and they live like, I don't know, savages or whatever they would think. So they wouldn't think they were very cultured. And it wouldn't even matter that the average amount of wealth is greater in the Americas than it was in England. And that's true because you can, get some land in the Americas, whether it's, land you got legally or not. Oh, I don't mean legally. It wasn't illegal. It was just unethical. Because they certainly made sure that taking the land away from the natives was legal because they created the laws. So, yeah. And of course, we talked a little bit before about how the natives didn't really see land as a possession. They didn't think anybody had title to it, so you didn't own the land. All right. All right, so the right to vote, opportunity to gain property, greater in the colonies, but deference was presumed. Deference, you don't say that, do you? Deference, anybody ever say that? So deference is where you give privilege to people who are better than you. Yeah, because we don't really have that concept. Do you think about, well, who's better than me? And you go like, oh, Serna, I give deference to her. So it's like some sort, yeah, I know it's not me. Some sort of respect or extra privilege to people that you see as better than you. In this instance, probably of an upper class or a ruling class. So deference is presumed toward people who are wealthier and have more authority. Like, I don't know, in high school setting, maybe it's you give deference to marching band members. Kidding. Football team members. I don't know. Soccer team members, probably not. Yeah. Okay. Deference. I don't know. In the ACC world, I would give deference to a full professor. I'm just an adjunct, so I'm not quite as cool, but I'm also an adjunct with a lot of experience, so I'm cooler than some other adjuncts. So, I'm not at the bottom of the list. So some people show me deference. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. And in high school, when I taught high school, trying to think, did any of those coaches show me deference only when they needed a test or something? You know what I'm saying? Coaches. Yeah. Of course, they never asked me to help them coach football, did they? So they knew it. Yeah. Their expertise was different than mine. All right. Although some of those guys and women are, really fine historians. I think Jensky's a really good historian. I wouldn't mess with her anyway. Smack you with that softball bat. I know her. All right. So she wouldn't do that. She might do that. All right. Since we got to talk about salutary neglect. Jensky definitely does not practice salutary neglect. She teaches those freshmen. You can't ignore those kids. They do stupid stuff if you ignore them. All right. So salutary neglect is the idea that you leave somebody alone to kind of take care of their own business, and it's good for them, so that they grow and prosper really under their own guidance. Why it doesn't work with freshmen, right? Juniors and seniors, maybe not. Okay. But the colonists were under a system which will be referred to as salutary neglect. They really don't have a whole lot of oversight from the English authorities. There's not a whole lot of troops from England there. There's not a whole lot of royal officials telling them what to do. They develop their own systems of government. And as we've already noticed, they're a little bit different from colony to colony. They have their own economic systems. Now, I mean, there's still rules. They've got to use English currency. There's, in certain ways, they've got to use English transportation for their goods and services. Sometimes they sneak around that. They do have a system of English laws, or they develop their systems based on English laws. Certainly, English is the main language. So it's not that there isn't an impact politically, socially, economically, linguistically from England. It's just that they're self-governing. They kind of take care of their own business. Now, this will work until the English kind of notice. It's like, hey, we're in debt and they have more money than we do. And how did we let that happen? We just let them do their own thing and we didn't tax them. And now we're in debt from some big war that we fought to protect them. So we're going to make them pay. And that's going to create an issue. So the end of salutary neglect is going to create an issue. So you do have to know what this is for the quiz. I promise you that's on the quiz, salutary neglect. So just the general idea that colonies developed independent of British oversight. So salutary neglect officially means, like if you're looking for a literal definition, because don't kids love literal definitions? You know what neglect is. Salutary means beneficial. So beneficial neglect, which seems like an oxymoron, you know what I'm saying? But the salutary part, the beneficial part, is that they prospered and grew economically, even without the oversight, even though they were neglected, essentially, or left alone by the English government. But that also makes them, here's a shock, although you already knew this, they were, yes, unwilling to pay taxes. It's like a bunch of Texans. Yeah, we don't like taxes. Nobody likes taxes, do they? But they figured they manage their own business. Why would they send money back to England? They don't really see that England has given them support that has been beneficial to them. They figure the neglect is more beneficial. This is going to become a problem after the French and Indian War, because that's when the English develop a pretty large amount of debt. So problems are coming. Other things that are mentioned in this section, colonial assemblies saw their job as protecting their independence or their rights from the British, who might come in and try to take their money or put new rules on them, that kind of stuff. So these are definitely colonies that think that they should run their own business and the English should kind of stay out of their way. And they've been successful, so why shouldn't they? The English should just let them do their thing. And they see themselves as really patriotic because they're expanding the English Empire, quite literally, geographically speaking, yes. Colonial press also talks a lot about politics, and almost everything that's written and read during that time period in the colonies is about politics. I don't know if that's changed dramatically, as I see the impeachment still on my television. And there's another class where somebody's grandma was in the other room watching the impeachment. But my grandma was really concerned about impeachment. It's like, yeah, it's interesting, especially the grandma. So they talk about the John Peter Zenger trial, which really is, it's an early freedom of speech, freedom of the press kind of trial. Zenger was a newspaper publisher, pretty sure it was New York. I know it was New York. And he said some bad stuff about some rich dudes. And he got sued for slander or libelous slander, something along those lines, saying bad stuff about him in the press. And his lawyer was Alexander Hamilton, who seemed to dance and sing in the courts all the time. I don't know what was up with that. Okay. But I don't know that they actually danced or sang about the Zenger trial in the Hamilton musical. But Hamilton's defense was that if what you write is true, it doesn't matter if it defames someone. So the defense against slander or libel is truth. So it's why the press just has to be honest. Yeah, as long as what you write is true. And they also start to develop an idea that there's different rules for people who are public figures and different rules for people who are private. So, while you could write kind of bad things about a Kardashian or Donald Trump or something like that, you probably shouldn't publicly say bad things about, say, your history professor, because I'm not really a public figure. You know what I'm saying? All right, I'm not up there on Kardashian level. All right, which is good. I probably wouldn't be, I'd make more money as a Kardashian, but I wouldn't be as good at history. All right, same time in Europe. So we're talking mid 1700s, you're starting to see early to mid, the development of the European Enlightenment and some of those ideas coming over to the American colonies. Enlightenment is more of a focus on science and rational thought. And the idea is not so much that they're throwing God out, although a couple of those folks did. Oh, who's the French guy that did? Voltaire. Voltaire is just tossing God over. That's why we don't like Voltaire in the United States. We like God. Dang French people tossing out God. But you might see the development of deism during this era, which is the idea that God is a creator, and that as the creator set nature in motion, and that nature follows the laws that were set and established by God. So you see God as a creator, but not the guy, person, entity, whatever, who is involved in your daily life. So if you are one of those people, like you stub your toe and you start praying that your toe will heal, according to this philosophy, God's really not concerned about your toe. If you're fairly healthy and you didn't slice your toe too much, nature will take its course and your toe will heal. You're not very healthy and you were careless and didn't wear shoes, you might lose your toe. And it's not because God's mad at you, it's because you weren't healthy and you were careless. So it's nature's rules. Yeah, that sort of thing. And God's not going to intervene and fix your toe because God's, he's just hanging back looking at the creation. Some people are going to see that as rejection of God being involved in your daily life and a biblical understanding of God. So you're going to see a religious revival in reaction to that called the Great Awakening. And I did notice earlier today that my original notes say the Second Great Awakening, but it's the first one. So sorry. So the Great Awakening. Okay. So the Great Awakening might be a reaction to the Enlightenment and might be people concerned that we're throwing God out. Okay. Enlightenment leads you to, John Locke, our ideas of government, a lot of political philosophy. That crazy Isaac Newton guy who thinks about gravity and calculus and stupid stuff like that. And lots of political philosophy. What's the French guy? Rousseau. That guy he's a useless person, that Rousseau guy. I mean, his thoughts are really useful, but he's a really bad dude. Okay. That was judgmental, wasn't it? But he didn't really work and thought he was better than everybody else and kind of mooched off rich people, but then had a girlfriend, which is fine. People should date if they like. But then he had some kids with her. And it's like, yeah, you're lower class. I'm not claiming those kids. And those kids went to an orphanage while he hung out with rich people in vacation. I'm telling you, I didn't like him. I didn't. I just study him a lot for a European history class because my professor really liked him. It's like, he's a horrible person. And my professor went, yeah, we don't care. We're just thinking about the ideas. Like, yeah, you're not from the Midwest and you didn't grow up in a fundamentalist church. Okay, there you go. Sorry. All right, so Enlightenment ideas going to be involve people more in their government. I'm going to trace the laws of nature so we can figure out how nature works, so we can understand the mind of God. And the best way to understand the mind of God is to understand the laws of nature, which is why these guys would think your science teachers were the most holy people on campus. There you go. All right. The religious revival is not, I don't know. I was going to say it's not like crazy wild fanaticism sort of thing. But, you know, you might think of it, I don't know if you would think of it that way or not, but the most prominent members of the Great Awakening, representatives of the Great Awakening, were a British preacher named George Whitefield, who's an itinerant evangelist. And you're going like, of course he is. So itinerant means like wandering around, not confused wandering around, but visit like I'm lost, like The Weeknd in the halftime show. He was an itinerant entertainer this weekend. No. So the itinerant preacher goes from church to church. He doesn't have his own congregation. He visits other people's church. He's like the guest speaker. So, and the other fellow, Jonathan Edwards, he had his own church. And he's more of a theologian than a really good preacher. I'm sure he was a fine preacher. I don't mean it that way. I don't know. I wasn't there. By reputation, George Whitefield was really the more interesting, exciting preacher. That's why people ask him to come be the guest speaker. And Jonathan Edwards was the American dude who's a really good writer, a good theologian. This movement emphasized faith and joy and being more thankful for God. So having more appreciation for the fact that God chose you. They are not getting rid of predestination just yet. That'll come a little bit later, but they are wanting people to express more of their thanks for God for choosing them and have more of an emotional experience, not a necessarily traditional conversion experience that you might see in a modern evangelical church. You know, it's not quite like that because they really do still believe in predestination, which is where God chooses you. But that might even be cooler that God chose you. You didn't, you know, you're really special. So you got to be thankful for that salvation. So, and if you read the famous sermon by the Jonathan Edwards fellow, if you had an American literature class, your American literature teacher may have read it to you, called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And there's an excerpt of it in your book. And it really mostly says that God thinks that you're trash and dirty, and he can't even look at you because you're scum. So he's holding you over some fire and, you know, hell. And he can't even look at you, and he should drop you in. You completely deserve it, but he didn't. So you should be thankful. Just that you're still here, you should be thankful because you deserve to go to hell. Yeah. It's really inspiring. It wouldn't it wouldn't work at all in a modern church, except maybe like a super angry Baptist church. No offense if you attend a super angry Baptist church. Even most Baptist churches now are like super happy. But if you read more stuff written by Jonathan Edwards, and you're going like, who in their right mind would do that? I might have read some more of that. So thanks for calling me crazy. But he is really like a super happy dude. If you read his journal, it's like I was walking by the pond today and I saw a bluebird. Praise God for the bluebird. It was so beautiful. It just made my day. And then I went over to the meadow and I saw Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith is my friend. Thank you, God, for Mrs. Smith. I can't believe what a wonderful creation she is. And he was just like super happy about everything. So the Jonathan Edwards that we see in the You're Going to Hell and You Stink and God Can't Even Look at You sermon, which everybody reads, it's not really what he's trying to say. He's trying to get you to be more thankful that God didn't drop you because you deserved it. And it's God's love that kept you out of the fire. And you should appreciate God's love in creation and every aspect of your life. He actually seems to be, I didn't know him. I'm pretty old, but I didn't know him. But from his writings, he seems to be a pretty joyful kind of dude. Okay. All right. But sinners in the hands of an angry God doesn't feel joyful. All right, it's probably a good place to start rather than going into the whole French and Indian War thing. But notice that's all we have for next time. So we can review some stuff before the quiz and also talk about the weekly question, which could be fun to talk about. And was there somebody missing? Oh yeah, I should probably stop the recording while I talk about whoever's missing, right? I don't want to shame